Good evening, everyone. I'm thrilled that you are joining in with our study tonight as we continue to look at Daniel chapter 4. Before we get into that, just a couple of things. First of all, I hope that you've had a good day. I know, again, it seems so strange for us to be separated like we are. It's a unique situation, one that we've never been in before, but I've been so uplifted and encouraged by those of you who have made comments and mentioned our devotional time together each night, and hope that this has been helpful to you during this time. I do want to make mention of what we said last night, just by way of reminder. If you have taken pictures of your family worshiping during our time apart, please send those pictures, if you will, via email. You see the email address there on your screen, or via text, and you see the number there on the screen as well. So please include the names of your family members, those that are there in the picture. We will make sure we get everyone listed there. We're going to try to put together sort of a special video presentation over the course of the next week or two, just as a way to remind everyone that we are all still family. We're all still connected, and we're all still together, even though maybe physically we can't be in the same building. We can all still be together as the family of God. And as we've mentioned also, for those of you that are tuning in, or those of you that are taking a glance at this, or it's being shared to you by friends of yours or family members, please feel free to reach out. If there's anything that we can do as a congregation to help you, please reach out. If there's anything that I can do personally to help you, please do not hesitate to reach out using those same methods of communication. Tonight we just have 3 quick questions for our 3rd through 6th graders. Just 3 quick questions from last night's devotional. I know last night it got up a little bit late, so several of you may have missed out, maybe watching both of these together, or maybe a day or so behind. But just really quickly, these 3 questions that you could ask them and see, and ask them to go find the answer for you, parents, 3rd through 6th graders. Number 1, what did Nebuchadnezzar see standing tall in his dream? This is again from Daniel chapter 4. What did Nebuchadnezzar see standing tall in his dream? Number 2, who did Nebuchadnezzar see come down from the heavens? Who did Nebuchadnezzar see come down from the heavens? And then number 3, what did Daniel say was the interpretation of the dream? And perhaps that's the most important question of the 3, because ultimately that leads us into our discussion tonight on the closing of chapter 4. The interpretation of that dream was so heavy for Nebuchadnezzar that you're going to see, as we finish this study tonight, you're going to see a remarkable change in this man. We've seen sort of the roller coaster. We've gone on the roller coaster ride of emotions with Nebuchadnezzar. He's gone from basically being impressed by God as a bystander, someone on the outside looking in. He's been impressed by God and his taking care of Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah. We've seen him be angry towards the followers of God in their dealings because he's so upset. We saw in Daniel chapter 3 his anger towards Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah over their unwillingness to bow down to his image. We've seen that. We've seen after that experience with the fiery furnace and those 3 men coming out unharmed, we've seen him again remark at how much he's impressed by God. And at the end of chapter 3, there was more of a inclination that he was at least attracted to the idea of God a little bit more than he had been before. But then we noticed last night, at the beginning of chapter 4, he is still worshiping God in a way. We use that term sort of with quotes around it, worshiping God. He's speaking and saying all the right things, but as you get on into chapter 4, what you notice very quickly is that his heart is not right with God. He's saying the right things, and even in some cases acting the right way, but ultimately his heart is still not right with God. And so God calls him on that. God expects more from him as he's learning about who God is. There should be a move made by Nebuchadnezzar to cede control to God. And that is not happening. You continue to see Nebuchadnezzar placing himself on a pedestal, placing himself, if not equal to God, greater than God. And because of that, you see this vision come about that he doesn't know what to do with, this dream that he has no idea what it means. And when Daniel tells him, Daniel is even somewhat moved emotionally. If you remember Daniel's words, to summarize, where I wish that the interpretation of this dream was happening to your enemies, to those who were against you. I wish it was happening to anybody else but you. But instead, he says, look, this is what the dream means. And because of that, Nebuchadnezzar's frightened. And if you remember where we left off last night, we were discussing the way that Daniel leaves it with Nebuchadnezzar, which is, I want you to repent. I want you to learn. I want you to do better. I want you to give up these things, this antagonizing relationship you have with God, where you continuously seem to be putting yourself on a pedestal equal to Him. And Daniel says, I beg you to stop doing that, because all that's going to happen from it is destruction. And Daniel has grown to, I suppose, have something of maybe a begrudging respect for Nebuchadnezzar through all of his experience with him, working alongside him. And ultimately, Daniel looks at him and just says, I can't lie to you. I have to tell you the truth. And the truth is, there's some bad things headed your way unless you change. Well, verse 28 of chapter 4, where we'll start tonight, is just as simple and as direct and blunt as one could expect. All of this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. Ultimately, Daniel's pleadings, ultimately Daniel's wishes, ultimately Daniel's desire for Nebuchadnezzar to straighten out his path, well, it didn't happen. And truthfully, the way that all of this goes down, it's kind of summarized for us at the end of chapter 4. If you look at verse 29, at the end of 12 months, so literally Nebuchadnezzar has a year from the time that Daniel tells him the interpretation of the dream. Nebuchadnezzar has 1 year, 12 months. 12 months to get his act together, as it were. Now, I want you just to stop for just a second before we go on. And we are going to try to limit these, as I know that time has sort of gotten away from us in the past few nights, and we're going to try to do our best to limit these to 15 minutes, and I promise you I'll do my best I can. But I just want to pause here for just a moment and notice, how many times has God given you an opportunity? I mean, it's every day, literally, for us. Every day we have an opportunity to make sure our relationship's right with God. But I can't imagine being told what Nebuchadnezzar was told, and then being given a year before these things went into place. It sets the mind that Nebuchadnezzar really truly did have something of a heart issue, in the sense that he's been given all of this time. And rather than take advantage of all of that time that's been given him, all that leniency that's been given him by God, all that grace that's been given him by God, rather than taking advantage of that and developing a relationship now with the one true and living God, instead, look at what he says in verse 30. This is the attitude that he's come back to now, yet again. Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power? See all those pronouns again. I and my, and it's all about him. And look at what he says at the end of verse 30. The glory of my majesty. And verse 31 tells you, while those words were still in his mouth, there came a voice from heaven. O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken. The kingdom has departed from you. You will be driven from among men. Your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men, ate grass like an ox. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. Now, again, if you're Nebuchadnezzar, if you put yourself in his shoes, these words are haunting that you find in verses 31 and 32. It is the exact wording that Daniel had spoken to him. I mean, it is exactly what Daniel had told him was going to happen if he did not learn from his mistakes and change his way of life. And so, unfortunately, we see Nebuchadnezzar did not learn. Again, this roller coaster ride that he's on, with God, it's just going to lead to destruction. Now, I find this interesting because verse 34 is going to pick up with this first person acknowledgement by Nebuchadnezzar. It's almost as though he is taking over the pen, so to speak. He says, verse 34, at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. And here we go. I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? Now, this sounds much more like Daniel speaking than it does Nebuchadnezzar. And the reason why I bring that up is because it's as though there's been a breakthrough. That light bulb that was sort of dim before, that Nebuchadnezzar really wasn't truly having that aha moment, that realization of who he was dealing with. Now that light bulb is burning bright as Nebuchadnezzar has come face to face, as it were. In a figurative sense, he's come face to face with God. And he's realized how small he is. And rather than building a gigantic statue of 12 feet or however tall it wound up being, 90 feet, however tall, it matters not. Rather than building some giant statue and assuming himself to be equal to God, no. Instead, he sees himself just as Abraham did. When Abraham spoke to God in Genesis chapter 19, or Genesis chapter 18, excuse me, it is chilling when he says to God, look, don't destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. You gotta save these people. And he goes to bargain with God, as it were, for Sodom and Gomorrah. If you find this many righteous people, so on and so forth. But the interesting thing to that is this, that when you see Abraham come to the realization of who he's talking to, realizing that he has now spoken in a direct and somewhat antagonistic term to God, it is amazing. This is verse 27 of Genesis chapter 18. Abraham answered and said, behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. That is the realization that now Nebuchadnezzar has come to, is that I have been living a life that is dishonoring God. I who am of dust and ashes. The way Nebuchadnezzar words it is, none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? He realizes now. That light bulb is at full strength. He realizes who he's talking to and talking about. Verse 36, the same time my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors, my lord, sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. Now, you see all those pronouns again, my and I and me. The difference this time is what comes after it. That is verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven. For all his works are right, and his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. You see, the humility of Nebuchadnezzar at this point is so different. In times past, when he's used those pronouns, those singular, those selfish pronouns, I and me and my, he's meant it as he deserved the glory and the honor and the praise. Now he says those words about his kingdom and his majesty and splendor and all of those things, and says, but it's not due to me. It's not to my credit. It's because of the King of heaven. What a powerful message. It really is the idea of being lost and found. You see Nebuchadnezzar out in those moments. You see him out there and grazing like an animal, and his hair's growing to absurd lengths, and his fingernails and all these things. And the image is one who is completely and totally lost. And yet by the end of the chapter, what you find is someone who truly has been found, cleaned up, presented, and now understands his stance before God. It reminds me a lot of Luke 15. If you look over there and you look at the account, we've discussed this before, so you know sort of the point behind this. It's not really truly, should not be called the prodigal son, in the sense that there are two prodigal sons in this story. And really the story is not so much about the boys as much as it is about the father. and the father reaching down to the one who had gone off and made such a mess of his life and welcoming him home with a hug, and also reaching out to the one who had been there from day in and day out and also encouraging him to stay the course. What you find in Nebuchadnezzar's example, and I use that term example because it really is a lot like us personally. We have our roller coaster relationship with God where there are times where we're really on fire, where we're really driving and striving to do what God would have us to do. And then there are other times where, truthfully, if we were honest, we have selfishly put ourselves in front of God and said, God, I can do this on my own. But each and every time when you turn to find him, you find out he's been looking for you the whole time. And with Nebuchadnezzar, there were reasons why Daniel was constantly around him. There were reasons why the example of men like Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, why those men were right in front of Nebuchadnezzar. It was an attempt to bring to light his being lost and his need to be found. And finally, thank the Lord, by the time you end Daniel 4, he has come to the realization that his humility was lacking. There was none. It was selfish. And he now desires to live just as God would have him to live. Nebuchadnezzar is a powerful example. I encourage you to go back and watch all of these videos, Daniel 1 all the way even to this one tonight, and just take some notes on Nebuchadnezzar. Pay attention to him. Go back and then listen to him, and instead of focusing on the characters that you do know, maybe perhaps look at Nebuchadnezzar, one that we've always painted as sort of this evil, angry king, and he certainly had his moments. But I would encourage you to look at his story and see if you don't find a little bit of yourself there as well. And obviously we want to close tonight just by offering the opportunity, if any of you are in need of being found, you need to know that there is a God in heaven, and he loves you. And he loves you more than anybody or anything could ever possibly be loved. He cares for you deeply, and he wants you to be found. And if we can help you, please don't hesitate to reach out. Please leave a comment. Please share this with those that it might benefit. We look forward to tomorrow night. Tomorrow night we will be live streaming at 6:30 from our church building, where we will move into a new study. We've covered 2 Peter in our previous live streamed Bible studies, and we're going to move on tomorrow night into the book of 1 John. So I encourage you to have your Bibles ready and have your notebooks ready tomorrow night at 6:30 as we study together. As for tonight, I hope that you have a wonderful evening. We look forward to studying more together tomorrow if the Lord wills.